You've seen the photograph. Dolly Parton in white, 50 years married, standing beside the man almost no American ever saw. The perfect country love story. Except the groom in that picture had been to about one concert in 6 decades. Her record label ordered her not to marry him. She drove to Georgia anyway, told nobody, brought only her mother. Then came the hysterectomy, 18 months of collapse, a loaded gun, and by her own admission, another man. Everything you believe about Carl Dean came from one witness. She's the one who decided what survived. It began at a laundromat. Start with the picture, because the picture is the entire problem. In 2016, for their 50th anniversary, Dolly and Carl Dean renewed their vows in a small ceremony and released the images to the world. She wore a white gown. He wore a tuxedo and looked, frankly, like a man being processed through a formality. Dolly has said in multiple interviews that he wasn't enthusiastic about it, that she talked him into it, that the whole thing was more her idea than his. That's her account, and her account is all we have, because Carl Dean never gave a substantive interview in his life. Not one sit-down, not one profile. 58 years married to the most photographed woman in country music, and the man produced a public record you could fit on an index card. Now hold that photograph next to a piece of paper filed in Catoosa County, Georgia, May 30th, 1966. Ringgold, Georgia. A marriage license for Dolly Rebecca Parton, 20, and Carl Thomas Dean, 23. No press, no label executives, no industry friends. Her mother, Avie Lee, was there. A Baptist preacher performed it in his study. And the reason they were in Georgia at all is that Tennessee required a waiting period, and Georgia didn't. Ringgold was where you went when you didn't want to wait, and didn't want anyone watching. So who exactly was the marriage being hidden from? Not her family, not his. It was hidden from Monument Records, and specifically from Fred Foster, the man who signed her. By Dolly's repeated telling, Foster had asked her not to marry, or at minimum, to wait a year, because a young female singer with a husband was a harder product to sell. She's told this story for decades with a laugh in it. Strip the laugh out and look at what actually happened. A 19-year-old girl's employer told her who she could and couldn't marry, and she responded by getting married in another state and saying nothing about it for months. That's not a fairy tale. That's a woman learning, at 19, that her private life was a business asset other people expected to manage. Keep that in mind, because she never forgot it. To understand why she picked Carl Dean specifically, a man who would rather run a bulldozer than stand in a photograph, you have to go back to Locust Ridge, Sevier County, Tennessee, and to a house that had 12 children in it. She was born in January 1946 in a one-room cabin. The family story, which Dolly has told 1,000 times, and which is corroborated by the doctor's own later accounts, is that her father paid Dr. Robert F. Thomas for the delivery with a sack of cornmeal. Her mother, Avie Lee, married Robert Lee Parton at 15. By the time Avie Lee was in her mid-30s, she had borne 12 children. Her grandfather, Jake Owens, was a Pentecostal preacher, and the church she grew up in did not have a lot of room in it for ambitious women. Here's the detail that matters more than the poverty. Dolly has said, over and over, in interviews and in her memoirs, that she built her entire look on a woman in town whom the locals called trash. She saw the makeup, the tight clothes, the bleached hair, and she thought it was the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen. She decided that's what she was going to look like when she grew up. She has framed it as a joke, the cheap look, the town tramp, the flattering punchline about her own vanity. It's not a joke. It's a strategy she formed before she was 10 years old. She figured out that a look could be a costume, that a costume could be armor, and that people who thought they were laughing at you weren't paying attention to what you were doing. By 10, she was already working. Her Uncle Bill Owens drove her to Knoxville to sing on Cass Walker's radio and television programs, a grocery store magnate's show that turned local kids into local names. At 13, she cut a single called Puppy Love for a small Louisiana label and stood on the Grand Ole Opry stage. She was a professional child. She learned microphone technique, patter, timing, and how to handle grown men in a control room before she learned to drive. She also learned something less charming. She watched her mother. Dolly has been unusually direct about this across 60 years of interviews. She loved her mother. She did not want her mother's life. 12 pregnancies, no money of her own, no exit. Every choice Dolly Parton made about her own marriage runs through that observation. She did not want a man who needed her at home. She wanted a man who would let her leave and still be there when she got back. She graduated Sevier County High School in 1964 and left for Nashville the next day with cardboard luggage and her uncle's phone number. She was 18 years old. Within her first few days in town, she was standing outside the wishy-washy laundromat on Broadway, waiting on her clothes, because she had almost nothing and had to wash what she had. A white Chevy pickup slowed down. The driver was Carl Thomas Dean, born in Nashville in 1942, who worked in his family's asphalt paving business. Dolly's version of the first line he ever spoke to her, and again, her version is the only version that exists, is that he warned her she was going to get sunburned standing out there. She has told it identically for 50 years, which is either the mark of a true memory or the mark of a woman who is very good at her material. Probably both. He asked her out. She said she was busy, which she was. What happened over the next 2 years is genuinely the most interesting part of this story, and it's the part the fairy tale flattens. Carl Dean did not fall in love with Dolly Parton, the star. There was no star. She was an unknown teenager sleeping on a relative's couch, writing songs with her uncle, getting turned down. He met her before the machine existed, and by every account he passed down through her, he had no interest whatsoever in the machine when it arrived. He didn't like the music business. He didn't like the people in it. He didn't want to be looked at. Understand what that meant to an 18-year-old girl from Locust Ridge who had already decided that everything about her public self would be manufactured to her own specifications. Here was one person in Nashville who wanted nothing from her career because he didn't believe in her career. She got a man who stayed home and asked for nothing. He got a woman who left. That's not a romance. That's a compatibility of avoidances, and it worked for 58 years, which is longer than almost anything else in American entertainment has worked. They dated for 2 years. Dolly has said her mother wanted them to wait, and they did. Then Foster told her to wait longer, for entirely different reasons, and that's when she stopped waiting. Look at the wedding again, because the smallness of it was not modesty. It was a business decision. There was no honeymoon worth the name. There was no announcement. There was no photograph released to Music City News. Ringgold gave them a preacher, a courthouse record, and no delay. Her mother stood up with her. She wore a simple white dress. And then Dolly went back to Nashville and kept working. And for the better part of a year, the label was not told what had happened in Georgia. She has laughed about this too, the naughty girl who defied the boss. But consider the actual arrangement she constructed at 20 years old. She had a husband who would not appear in public, a marriage the industry didn't know about, and a career she intended to run herself. Every element of the Carl Dean legend that America finds so touching, the privacy, the silence, the man who never wanted the spotlight, was operational from day one. It protected him. It also protected her. And it worked immediately. In 1967, she started charting for Monument with Dumb Blonde and Something Fishy, and the songs did exactly what her whole look had done since she was a child. They let people underestimate her while she counted the receipts. Her first hit was literally about being wrong to call her stupid. That same year, a man who had been watching those charts made her an offer. He had a syndicated television show, a national audience, a rhinestone suit, and a very specific idea about what her role was going to be. He would take more of her time, more of her money, and more of her control than Carl Dean ever asked for in 58 years. And when she finally tried to leave him, he sued her for $3 million. Carl Dean, by his wife's account, hated the man on sight. Porter Wagner was 39 years old, a fixture on syndicated television in something like 100 markets and the owner of the most recognizable pompadour in Nashville. He had an opening in his show because Norma Jean Beasler was leaving. In September 1967, he hired Dolly Parton to fill it, and the audience booed her for the better part of a year because they wanted Norma Jean back. She has told that story often. What she mentions less is the paperwork. Porter didn't just hire a girl singer. He got her onto RCA by personally guaranteeing her sales against his own royalties. He produced or co-produced her records. He took a piece of her publishing through their business entanglements. He had a stake in her touring. For 7 years, the arrangement was that Porter Wagner had a financial interest in nearly every professional thing Dolly Parton did, and he made most of the decisions about what she sang, when she sang, and who she sang it with. He also, by many accounts from people inside that operation, could be brutal about it. He had a temper. He controlled the microphone. On the show, she was the pretty girl standing to his left. Carl Dean did not like him. That comes from Dolly, which is the caveat you have to attach to almost every private thing in this story, but she has repeated it consistently and without much softening. Carl thought Porter was a phony. Carl thought Porter was using her. Carl did not want to spend time around him. And here's where the shape of this marriage starts to show itself. Carl's solution to disliking his wife's business partner was not to confront him, or to travel with her, or to insert himself into her professional life at all. He stayed home. That was the whole arrangement, and it was already fully formed by 1968. She went out into a world run by men like Porter Wagoner, and Carl kept the house, kept the business, kept the land, and kept his mouth shut. There is no evidence he ever came to a show, met the label, sat in on a session, or offered an opinion that changed anything. Whether that was devotion or abdication depends entirely on which version of the story you were sold. The house was in Nashville, and later the property outside it that would become their real base. Carl ran his asphalt paving company. He owned a bulldozer and appears to have genuinely enjoyed operating it. He had a truck, he had land, he had, in other words, a complete life that did not require an audience. And Dolly's schedule by the early 70s was already the schedule of a woman who was gone most of the time. They did not have children. They wanted them. Dolly has said so plainly for 50 years. What they had instead were her siblings. Through the 1970s, several of the younger Partons came to live with them, Frida, Rachel, Randy at various points, and Carl Dean, the man who supposedly wanted nothing to do with anything, helped raise them. The nieces and nephews called her Aunt Granny, which is where the Dollywood restaurant name eventually came from. There's a nickname for Carl too, passed down secondhand, but here's the honest note. Nearly every domestic anecdote about him traces back to Dolly, or to family members repeating Dolly. He left no record of his own. Take that seriously for a second. A man was married to an international celebrity for 58 years, and produced, deliberately, almost no evidence that he existed. That is not shyness. That is a policy, maintained with extraordinary discipline over 6 decades. And it had a consequence nobody talks about. It meant the only person who could ever describe the marriage was the person selling records. In 1973, she wrote Jolene. The song's origin has 2 threads, and she's told both. The name came from a little red-headed girl in an autograph line who told Dolly her name was Jolene. The situation came from home. By Dolly's account, there was a bank teller, tall, red hair, who flirted with Carl and whom Carl found reasons to visit rather often. Dolly has said she teased him about it, that it was mostly harmless, that she wrote the song out of that friction. Look at what that means chronologically. She was 27, on television every week, becoming famous, and the one documented moment of romantic threat in the entire marriage involves her being afraid a woman in a bank would take her husband. Not the reverse. Within 2 years, the geometry flipped permanently and never flipped back. She was the one on the road 200 nights a year. She was the one in a business full of people who wanted things from her. And there is no second Jolene, no later song, no later account of Dolly Parton worrying about a woman near her husband. That anxiety belonged to a marriage that was still, briefly, symmetrical. The same year she wrote it, she started planning her exit from Porter Wagoner. She has said she tried to explain it to him and couldn't get through, so she did what she always did and wrote it down instead. I Will Always Love You is a breakup letter to a business partner. That's not interpretation. She's confirmed it repeatedly. And Porter confirmed it too. He was in the room when she played it for him. He cried. Then he told her he'd let her go if he could produce it, which he did. She left the show in 1974. The clean version of the story ends there, with a beautiful song and a graceful parting. The actual version ends in 1979, when Porter Wagoner sued her for $3 million, claiming she owed him for the career he'd built. It settled in 1980, reportedly for around $1 million, plus other considerations, and by most accounts she also had to buy back rights and publishing interests to fully separate herself. She spent years and a fortune getting out of a relationship she'd entered at 21. There's a harder question underneath the lawsuit, and it needs to be handled carefully. In later years, Porter claimed to biographers and interviewers that his relationship with Dolly had been physical. Dolly has always denied it, firmly, publicly, repeatedly. Porter was, by then, a man with grievances, a memoir interest, and a reputation to reclaim. Dolly is a woman with a marriage myth to protect. Historians and biographers remain genuinely divided. What can be said with confidence is narrower and more damning in its own way. For 7 years, the most consequential relationship in Dolly Parton's life was not her marriage. It was a contract. And when it ended, her husband had not been involved in any part of it. Then came the years that America remembers as her greatest, and that she has described as the worst of her life. 1980 gave her 9 to 5, a #1 single, an Oscar nomination, a hit film, and a level of crossover fame that country artists simply did not have then. 1982 gave her The Best Little Whorehouse in Texas with Burt Reynolds, a production she has described as miserable. Somewhere in there, her body started failing. She collapsed on stage in Indianapolis in 1982. She has said she was bleeding internally. There were gynecological problems that went on for a long time and that she has never described in clinical detail, and in 1984 she had a partial hysterectomy. That ended it. There would be no children. The decision that had been sitting in the future since 1966 was closed permanently in an operating room when she was 38 years old. What followed was, by her own account in her 1994 memoir and in interviews since, about 18 months of collapse. She gained a significant amount of weight. She stopped working the way she had worked since she was 10. And she has said, this is the part that gets quoted and then hurried past, that she sat on her bed one afternoon with a loaded gun and thought seriously about using it. She has said what interrupted her was her dog running up the stairs, and that she took it as a sign, and that she put the gun away. Here's the thing that stops you cold about that period. Ask yourself where Carl Dean was. The honest answer is that we don't know. She has said he was supportive. She has said he told her he loved her at any weight. She has also, in the same era of interviews, described that stretch as the loneliest of her life. There is no third-party account, because there never is. The man had made himself unavailable to the historical record, and the cost of that policy is that during the single worst crisis of his wife's life, we have no independent evidence of what he did. What we do have is what she said next. Because at some point in that same broken window of the mid-1980s, the timing is hers, and it is not precise. Dolly Parton says she fell in love with someone else. She has never named him. She has never dated it precisely. What she has done, in interview after interview across 3 decades, is admit it happened. The phrasing changes slightly depending on the year and the interviewer. She's described a serious involvement with a man during a rough stretch in her marriage. She's joked that they had a 7-year itch that lasted longer than 7 years. She said, in her 1994 memoir, that there was a period when she and Carl came close to going their separate ways, and that she was in love with someone she couldn't have, and couldn't stop thinking about. In one telling, she says she wrote her way out of it, that the misery went into songs, and the songs made money, and the money kept her working. Now weigh that honestly. This is a self-disclosure, not an expose. No journalist caught her, no photograph exists. Nobody has ever produced a name, and biographers who have gone looking have come back with speculation and nothing more. Which means we're relying entirely on the testimony of a woman who volunteered a confession that damaged nothing, cost nothing, and arrived pre-softened with a joke. That's exactly the point. Look at what the admission accomplishes. It makes her human. It makes the marriage look tested and therefore real. It gives interviewers something to chew on that isn't Carl. And it is completely unverifiable, unfalsifiable, and unfollowable, because the only door to it is her mouth. She's done that her whole career. The Playboy cover in 1978. The rhinestones, the wig jokes. She hands you something scandalous with one hand so you stop reaching with the other. She told a reporter once that she looks cheap on purpose because it takes a lot of money to look that cheap. Same technique. Give them the punchline before they can write one. So the 7-year itch is true in the way everything about this marriage is true. Because she said so. In a form she chose. At a time she chose. What matters more is what she built while it was happening. Because the same woman who was collapsing on stage in Indianapolis and sitting on a bed with a gun came out the other side, and in a period of roughly 5 years, constructed the most complete independent apparatus any woman in American entertainment has ever had. She took on Sandy Gallen as her manager, a Hollywood operator who handled Cher and Michael Jackson's television work. Not a Nashville man, not a country man. In 1986, she partnered with the Hershen family to convert a struggling Ozark theme park in Pigeon Forge into Dollywood. Not an endorsement. Ownership. A stake in a business that employs thousands of people in the county where she was born poor, in the shadow of the mountain she grew up on, with her name on the gate. She kept her publishing. That's the one nobody mentions, and it's the one that mattered most. She owned I Will Always Love You. When Elvis Presley wanted to cut it in the 70s, Colonel Tom Parker's people told her Elvis had to have half the publishing. She said no and walked away from Elvis Presley. She has admitted she cried all night over it. In 1992, Whitney Houston's version of that song became one of the best-selling singles in the history of recorded music. And every cent of the songwriting money came to Dolly Parton. Because at 28 years old, she had refused to give a piece of herself away to a man who assumed she'd fold. She used the Whitney money, by her own account, to invest in a black neighborhood in Nashville, and she has been dry about the symmetry of it. She also poured money into Sevier County. The Imagination Library, launched in 1995, mails free books to children and has now shipped more than 200 million of them worldwide. It was named for her father, who could not read. None of this involved Carl Dean. That's the thing you have to sit with. The parallel life wasn't a rebellion against the marriage. It was the marriage. He had his land, his equipment, his company, his privacy. She had a park, a publishing catalog, a foundation, a management company, and a face on the side of buses in 4 countries. They lived in the same house and operated 2 entirely separate sovereign territories with a strict non-interference policy. And beside her, for 6 decades, was Judy Ogle. They met in Sevier County as children, reportedly around age 7. Judy became her assistant, her constant travel companion, the person in the room, the person on the plane, the person in the photographs at the edge of frame. For long stretches, Dolly spent more waking hours with Judy Ogle than with her husband, and she has never pretended otherwise. The rumors have followed them since the 70s. Dolly has addressed them the same way every time. She denies a romantic relationship, says they're best friends who sleep in the same room sometimes, the way girls do, and then makes a joke about it. Historians and biographers have nothing beyond the denial and the proximity. There is no document, no letter, no witness. But notice the structure. A woman married to an invisible man, traveling the world with a female friend for 50 years, in an industry and a religion that would have destroyed her for the wrong answer. The marriage answered the question before anyone could ask it. Whatever else Carl Dean was, and by every indication he was a real husband to a real wife, he was also, functionally, an unassailable alibi. That is not an accusation. It's an observation about what a hidden husband is worth to a woman whose entire product is her image. By the 1990s, the arrangement had hardened into something almost formal. He didn't come to the Country Music Association Awards. He didn't come to the Oscars. He didn't come to Dollywood openings. She has said he attended essentially one of her concerts in their entire life together, and that she couldn't perform properly with him sitting there, and that they agreed not to do it again. One show, 58 years. They took occasional trips in a camper. She said they liked driving. She said he'd read the paper and she'd write songs, and neither of them needed to talk. She said he thought her friends were ridiculous. She said he watched her on television. All of it from her. Every word. He appeared publicly perhaps a handful of times in 6 decades, and one of the last was a photograph from that vow renewal in 2016, when he was 73 and she talked him into a tuxedo. Carl Thomas Dean died on March 3rd, 2025, at 82 years old. The funeral was tiny. Reports describe roughly a dozen people. No press, no industry, no cameras, no public service for a man who had been married to Dolly Parton longer than most of the mourners had been alive. She released a short written statement asking for privacy for the family. It said they had spent many wonderful years together, and that words couldn't do justice to the love they'd shared for over 60 years. That was the entire public record of his death, initially. One paragraph, written by her. Then, a few months later, she released a song. If You Hadn't Been There is about Carl. She wrote it, she recorded it, she put out the images that accompanied it, she gave the interviews that framed it. He got a eulogy the way he got everything else in his public existence. Composed, produced, and distributed by his wife. And this is where the whole thing turns. For 58 years, the accepted reading of this marriage was that Dolly Parton protected her husband's privacy. Generous, loyal, almost saintly, in an industry that eats spouses. But protection and control are the same act performed with different motives, and there is no way to separate them here because the man never spoke. Every warm anecdote is hers. Every joke he supposedly made about her wigs is hers. The line about the laundromat is hers. His opinions of Porter Wagoner, his reaction to her weight gain, his feelings about children, his reasons for staying home, all hers, all unverifiable, all told by a professional storyteller who has been shaping her own material since she was 10 years old on Cass Walker's radio show. She didn't lie. There is no evidence she lied about anything. She simply held the only key to the room for 6 decades, and then outlived him. In 2015, at Dollywood's 30th anniversary, she sealed a song inside a time capsule on the park grounds. It's not to be opened until 2045, the park's 60th year, when she would be 99. Nobody has heard it. Nobody knows what it says. She wrote it, sealed it, and put a 30-year lock on it, which tells you everything about how this woman thinks about the difference between what she gives away and what she keeps. Now go back to the photograph. The white gown, the 50th anniversary, the husband in the tuxedo who, by her own account, had to be persuaded into the frame. For years that image circulated as proof of the great secret romance, the one marriage in show business that stayed clean. It's still true. That's what makes it so effective. But look at what it actually shows. 2 people who spent 5 decades in largely separate worlds, standing together for the second formal photograph of their marriage, because one of them decided it was time the world saw something. He came from a preacher's study in Ringgold, Georgia, where they got married in a hurry because a record executive told her not to. He left through a funeral with 12 people in it and a song written about him by someone else. Dolly Parton didn't sell America a false marriage. She sold America the only version of a real one that anyone would ever be permitted to see, and she priced it perfectly, and she never once let go of the negatives. The man in that photograph never gave an interview in his life. He didn't need to. He married a woman who could speak for both of them, and she did, for 58 years, and she's still the only witness left.